Okay, so here we go, continuing our review of Who's Minding the Mind. And we got up to paragraph 14. And what we saw that in this section, the same brain circuits, we're basically looking at a certain kind of information, and that kind of information has to do with the structure of the brain and the way in which the brain processes information. Okay, so we could say it's a physiological type of information. We're looking at physiological things, and we're looking at the way in which they actually work to explain our behavior. Okay, so paragraphs 15, 16, and 17 continue in this manner. Still talking about the brain. If you remembered, we talked about how the reptilian brain, or the ventral pallidum, which is below the conscious part of the brain, is activated and influences many times the higher levels of the brain, and that when they the one thing that they do know about the conscious brain is that it's in the outer levels, outer layers of the brain tissue. So it's really the phrase that was used is bottom up, from the bottom to the top. Here they give another perspective on this in paragraph 15, and they're talking about how this is actually something that developed through the progression of humans, an evolutionary perspective from the word evolution. The subcortical areas of the brain evolved first. What is the subcortical areas of the brains? Well, we know what it is. We know it's the ventral pallidum, or the reptilian brain, because we've just been reading about how those are the areas that are more instinctive, right? The subcortical areas of the brain evolved first, and why? Help the individual fight, flee, and scavenge before conscious, distinctly human layers were added later in evolutionary history, layers upon layers. It's an explanation from an evolutionary perspective of the structure of the brain. In this sense, Dr. Barr argues. What does argue mean? Argue means that this is what he claims. This is what he says is true. He's reached this conclusion through studying. Okay? Argues unconscious goals can be seen as open-ended adaptive agents acting on behalf of the broad genetically encoded aims automatic survival systems. So now we've taken this idea of the priming to another level altogether, that it's not just a cute psychological interesting experience, but that it actually is connected to, at some level, our evolution. It had to do with survival systems, that they are agents, open-ended, adaptive, and the word adapt, agents acting on behalf of our broad genetically encoded aims. What does that mean, acting on behalf of? That means that that is their task, that is their job. The agent's job is to pursue, to develop, to try and get us the aims of surviving. That's at the most basic level. Here's another psychologist who did some more research. Again, you're seeing very, very much about how research is used in this article to support the ideas that they're bringing. Everything is being supported by research. Okay, so research shows, Mark Shaler did research showing that when self-protected instincts are primed, again primed from the word priming that we already learned, what are they priming? These instincts that we talked about, these very evolutionary instincts that tell us to fight, flee, and scavenge. It's about survival. Right? So Mark Shaler found that when instincts, self-protective instincts are primed, gives an example of turning down the lights. Turning down the lights means basically turning off the lights or making the lights dimmer. Taking the light that it's not so bright, making it less bright. Here's something that's very relevant to what's going on right now. So when that happens, you're making the room darker. White people who are normally tolerant become unconsciously more likely to detect hostility in the faces of black men with neutral expressions. This is his findings, okay? This is what he did in his experiment, part of it probably, and this is what he found. And now he's explaining it. Sometimes non-conscious effects can be bigger in sheer magnitude than conscious ones. Again, we're comparing non-conscious and unconscious. In this case, he's saying non-conscious overwhelm the conscious. Because we can't moderate stuff that we don't have conscious access to, and the goal stays active. So what's he saying? He's saying that because we aren't aware of where our behavior is coming from, because it's unconscious, we can't stop it. We can't say, oh, wait a minute, that's not how I choose to react. And the goal of survival that we talked about in the previous, the goal of survival is always there. It's genetically encoded. And so we are not aware that our behavior changes because we don't know what is affecting it. Okay? So, continuing, this article has led us down certain paths, giving us a background, setting up the background for getting to this information now, that of how, through the brain structure, we are influenced by unconscious acts. Until it is satisfied, till the goal, the basic primal goal of survival, until it is satisfied, when the program is subsequently suppressed, the research suggests. So the it is the active goal, and it must be satisfied. That, in other words, the goal must be reached, or we must feel like it is being reached. In other words, the program is suppressed. That's when the unconscious motivators feel like they have achieved the program of surviving, and it is what they would call in this article suppressed. Another study comes to show us that some researchers at Northwestern University, the subjects were undergraduates. They had to do one of two things, two groups: an unethical deed like betraying a friend, or a virtuous deed like returning property. Okay, so they were asked to remember either one of these two things when they came in. Remember an unethical deed or a virtuous deed. And afterwards they were given a choice of a gift, an antiseptic or a pencil. And here are the findings. This is what they found. Those who recalled bad behavior were twice as likely as the others to take the wipe. So the people who took the pencil were half as likely as the others to take the wipe, right? It goes back and forth. They had been primed to psychologically cleanse their consciousness. This is, again, this study comes to show us what it means to have the program satisfied. Once their hands were wiped, the students became less likely to agree to volunteer their time to help with the graduate school program. Their hands were clean, unconscious goal had been satisfied, and now was being suppressed. Its findings suggest. Right? So let's look at this again. How many steps and what did they lead to? Undergraduates, students who are studying in their first degree, a BA or BS, the undergraduates were first asked to remember one of two things, an unethical deed or a virtuous one. Then they were asked to pick between two gifts, antiseptic wipe or a pencil. There was a finding immediately that the people who remembered the unethical deed were more likely to choose the antiseptic wipe. Then what happened? They wiped their hands, and then they were asked to volunteer. So this is another step in the research study. They were asked to volunteer their help to help with a graduate school project. Once their hands were clean, they were less likely to agree to volunteer. Right? So let's take a quick look at the questions now. Almost reached the end. First of all, this was way back here. We talked about 8 and 9, the two experiments, two research studies, if you remember, which wanted to prove that, in fact, the evidence for psychological hot wiring has been overwhelming. In paragraphs 8 and 9, they gave us the two experiments, the two research studies that they said prove that. And so this question is simply to fill out. Just going to undo all of this. Okay, so the question was to fill out the researchers and location, the subjects, number of groups, the type, the procedure, the results, and the explanations. Right? So we discussed this. There were two experiments. Don't need to go back into it again. Okay. And we talked about in paragraph 10, what does the fast driving and the buying wine and cigarettes prove? Conscious takes over our conscious controls. Remember, there was also an experiment about gripping, the hand grip, where the subjects were asked to play a computer game, right, about the money. So what does that prove? Remember, when it says give a general idea, not specifics. Okay, not specifics means don't give the details of the experiment. Give the basic concept that we are talking about. Right, then we got to paragraphs 13 and 15. What is the general topic of discussion, general subject of discussion in paragraphs 13 to 15? Well, we just talked about that. Evolutionary neurological explanation of unconscious role in decision making. Okay, what idea is the information provided in paragraph 13 to 15 supposed to prove or support? That our decisions are made in the unconscious before they become conscious. And finally, let's go to 16 and 17. In terms of Shaler's experiments in paragraph 1, which goal stays active? The survival instinct, right? That's what we talked about. And now let's summarize from paragraph 17 the research. Okay? So and this is what we found, that there were two groups of college students and what they had to do, and then what happened and the results of that, and the conclusion. Right? So I'm going to stop here, and we'll do the very last part in class. So make sure that you have reviewed these recordings carefully and are able to understand when we talk about it in class. Thank you.